we are privileged here to have tonight three Talmidim of the Rav, Rabbi Herschel Schechter, Rabbi Menachem Genack, and Rabbi Meir Twersky. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to have a conversation about the Rav and about some of the issues regarding his legacy. The first question, which I'd like to pose to one of Rabbi Soleveitchik's prize students as well as his grandson, to Rabbi Meir Twersky, is about that quote regarding the Rav's loneliness, where the Rav says, "Let me emphasize, however, that by stating I am lonely does not mean that he doesn't have friends, but there's a state of loneliness." It makes it sound as the Rav always felt alone. That's not my personal memory of the Rav. Perhaps, Rabbi Twersky, you could share with us what the Rav meant when he penned that sentence.
Throughout the Rav's life, he enjoyed very fulfilling and meaningful relationships within his family, with his parents, with other relatives as well, with Menachem Krakovsky, the Avodas HaMelech, with friends, with Talmidim, and these were very fulfilling and meaningful relationships. But when the Rav spoke of loneliness, he wasn't speaking in social or psychological terms or categories. The Rav himself explained what he meant, and that was simply the Rav's interpretation of the faith experience was one which engendered loneliness. It was a philosophical category that he was employing. The sense that a man of faith has when he doesn't feel that closeness, that proximity to the Ribono Shel Olam, is one that engenders loneliness. The sense of being apart and removed from the secular technological society is one which engenders loneliness in a man of faith. I think later in the essay, Lonely Man of Faith, the Rav says that loneliness is nothing but the act of doubting one's ontological worth, legitimacy, and reasonableness. It was a philosophical category of mo'onu mechayenu, and one, again, a loneliness which was engendered by when the person loses, even for a fleeting moment, that sense of connection to the Ribono Shel Olam, the sense of being apart from society. And we need to be very, very wary in thinking about the Rav, talking about the Rav, not to lower him to our own level, but to try to look upward and glimpse him on his level.
Rabbi Genack, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I would add just to what Rabbi Twersky said, that just in terms of speaking a little bit about the Rishta Derech, because I think it relates to the sense of loneliness as well. The root of the Rishta Derech was really there was a theological dimension to it, namely that the Rav would always say, our job is not to explain the why, but the what, because the why, in terms of God's motivation, is beyond human comprehension, and God's will is self-justifying. There's no need for God to explain. Our job, in terms of Bris Columbus, was simply to define the given, and the notion, which of course Maimonides develops, the Ram develops, that God in a sense is completely unknowable. I think that generated this sense which Rabbi Twersky speaks about, that sense of loneliness. But there was another aspect about the Rav related to that, is also in terms of the individual is, each individual is unique. That's an important theme in all of his writings. That's the basis, the foundation of the mitzvah Avelos. And each person's uniqueness and his specialness and his, therefore, because he's unique, his incompatibility, that he can't be submerged in a crowd, that also generates this sense of ontological loneliness, but not necessarily social loneliness.
Rav Schechter, how would you describe the Rav's approach to Psak Halacha when so many people seem to suggest that they receive different answers to the same question?
I think it is correct that different people receive different answers to the same question. Take, for example, many years ago, my wife had a baby, we had a shaila in Hilchos Nida. So I asked one of the local rabbanim here, who happened to be an Ungarisher. So he says, if it would have been a yekka, I live on Ben Adam. He said, if it would have been a yekka, he would have given a different psak, but because I'm not a yekka, I'm from Eastern Europe, he's giving a different psak. Rabbi Soleveitchik would give a different psak to different people. I remember one fellow approaches me, he says, Rabbi Soleveitchik held from the head to Mechira for Shemitah. How does he know? Because before he went on Aliyah, he asked the Rav, what should I do next year is a Shemitah year? Rabbi Soleveitchik said, do you sell your chametz? Do you rely on Mechira's chametz? You can rely on the head to Mechira. In the yeshiva, Rabbi Soleveitchik explained why his family tradition is that there is no het mechira; it just doesn't exist. So this fellow was a pasha to balabas. He asked us fadrei makot. This balabas, he's not a talmud of his. He doesn't have to follow all of his psakim. So he doesn't rely on the het mechira like he relies on mechira's chametz. For the talmidim, he gives a different psak. This is a common practice. Many rabbanim do this. He gives one psak for one person, a different psak for another person. As Rabbi Soleveitchik used to say, that it echad nemen b'yisurim doesn't apply to say over a psak. He told us in class, if anybody tells you over my name a psak, al pidin, you're not permitted to believe him, because it echad nemen b'yisurim, people have nemanis only on what the facts of the case are, not on what the psak was. He showed a Mishnah like that, and Gemara is like that. He said people are going to say over psakim in his name, and different situations for different people. He's given different psakim, even if it's exactly the same case. He was very careful with his psakim. I think he was very clear with his psakim. He would explain in the yeshiva what his psakim were based on. Very clear. I just wanted to add one comment about the loneliness. I was impressed by the movie. This is the third time that I saw the movie. It's very moving. I was impressed. Every single picture has Rabbi Soleveitchik with such a big smile. He would crack jokes in the middle of class. He would crack jokes in the middle of a public lecture also. He would tell stories in the middle. He was a very levitic fellow, a very friendly person. I don't see how people can misunderstand that. I think that he was a lonely person.
In the apartment where many of us had the opportunity to live with Rabbi Soleveitchik, so when we were in college still, he would sometimes ask us what we were studying. So if we were studying Hebrew literature, he would ask us which poems, and then he would recite the poems by heart when we had difficult reading them in the text. And then he would ask us if we were having a test on it, and we would tell him basically we were. He would ask us questions, and he would smile, and he would laugh with us because he thought we were so unprepared for his test, and for any test in the college. But there was always that friendliness. There was always that sense of joy in Rabbi Soleveitchik. Rabbi Twersky, I'd like you to reflect upon this, if you may. From a very early age, the Rav was nurtured with the Torah of Brisk. And at a later age, he attended the University of Berlin. The Rav wrote an essay called Halachic Man, which magnificently describes the typology of the Ish Halacha, which describes Rav Chaim, his grandfather. But he wrote that essay, that beautiful essay about the man of Brisk, he wrote it with the language of Berlin. How do we deal with all of these discussions regarding the potential conflicting typologies between the Rav, the man of Brisk, and the Rav, the man that attended the University of Berlin?
I think that the operative word here is that everything which the Rav studied and he experienced coexisted harmoniously within him. Meaning that the Rav, his roots deeply implanted in the soil, in the terrain of Torah Shebaal Peh, was free to accept and use and draw upon what he found in Chochmah to be consistent and compatible and helpful in his presentation. And he felt no apologetic need to reconcile that which was inconsistent or incompatible. When you either listened to the Rav draw upon his unequaled mastery of Torah, lahavdil, of Chochmah as well, it was 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Sometimes he would use Chochmah, again, as you mentioned, in Isha Halacha and other places, as helpful categories for presenting Torah, and other times it was used as a contrast, and it was the critique. There are many, many sweeping critiques of Western thought and Western civilization. Within the essay which gives the film its title, The Lonely Man of Faith, so the Rav has in one sentence dismisses a large part of the history of Western philosophy, saying that they missed the point in all their attempts to prove the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because what they were doing is rendering HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rachmana litzlan, impersonal. And in one fell swoop, that there is this critique of Western thought. So there was no tension, because the Rav didn't have any dual loyalty. The Rav was rooted in Torah. The Rav stood within a tradition which the Rambam stood within the tradition, the Ramah stood within the tradition, the Malbim stood within the tradition. Many, many Gedolei Yisrael throughout the generations who clearly valued Chochmah. They valued Chochmah, but Chochmah had to be filtered through the lens of Torah. What Torah approved of, what was helpful and consistent with Torah, was something the Rav drew upon, and what was inconsistent and incompatible, so the Rav simply dismissed, or if anything, highlighted the contrast between the Torah's approach and that which is to be found in the Western thought.
There's a famous letter that Rabbi Soleveitchik wrote to the city fathers, whoever it was, who were deciding who was going to be the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv when the Rav was a candidate in the 1930s. And he writes, first of all, that my son is a yochid b'havanas haTorah, that he was unique in his generation. We have to remember this is in the 1930s, so Chaim Oizer was alive, when Mrs. Zalman was alive, that he was unique in his grasp and understanding of Torah. But he also says that he had now gotten a doctorate in philosophy, and all his professors exclaimed his extraordinary genius. So there was, clearly this is a factor, an important factor in terms of the Rav, his unique quality, but all of this is integrated into one person. The thing I'm not sure about the Rav, when he goes to Berlin and he gets a doctorate, he's very immersed in contemporary philosophical thought. There are two dimensions. One, of course, the Rav himself was an enormously curious person. Knowledge per se interested him. I remember there was once a doctor, who was a prominent oncologist who was doing research about cancer, and he wanted to meet with the Rav. He was also a Soviet Jewry activist, Sam Corman. And he wanted to meet with the Rav to talk to him about, they were having a program in Forest Hills. Menachem Begin then was coming to speak. He wasn't the prime minister yet. And he wanted to speak to the Rav about Soviet Jewry. So I arranged the meeting. So he asked Sam after, what did you think? So I said, I was just shocked how much he knew about research in terms of cancer. I'm not talking about, broad strokes. He knew about the toxicity of drugs. He knew, very specific areas of knowledge. So, first of all, he was a very curious man, and knowledge per se interested him. But also, that he used it in terms of the milieu of the time. He used it as, to fortify Torah, to be able to communicate to a new generation, both in the language and the vocabulary and the, logical constructs that were important to contemporary Jews. He leveraged it in an enormously important way to preserve the Jewish tradition. I once wrote an article at this one point. Everybody thinks of the Rav as being such a revolutionary, and this film also, of course, the divide between him and Rabbi Kotlin, all the Rosh Hashivas. but his approach was enormously conservative. He was using modern tools to conserve and preserve an ancient tradition, namely the Torah, that was very much at risk at that time in the United States. I compare him to the Ramban. The Rav used to say that the Briskei Derech you see in the Ramban, and the Ramban is the most original of the thinkers amongst the Rishonim. But when you think about what the Ramban wrote, everything he writes, every single volume of the Ramban, is to preserve the ancient tradition. He writes this on Chumash is in opposition to the Ibn Ezra to protect the tradition of Chazal and the Medrash. He writes the Sefer Mitzvahs to protect the Bahag. He writes the Milchamis in defense of the Rif. So on the one hand, he's enormously original, but it's always to preserve the old tradition, the tradition of Reb Chaim.
I think the Rav's position was he didn't feel that we have to be afraid of secular studies. Everything in the world, all of the Chachma in the world comes from the Rabban Shalom. Same one who gave the Torah, so there can't be any contradictions. So he didn't think that there was any chashash when the issue came up about having all the different graduate schools, opening up Einstein Medical School and so on. So he didn't think that we have to be worried about that. There aren't going to be any contradictions. Even what people think, not only about Chochma Sateva, he has one of the published essays is an interpretation of the passage in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, where the Gemara has different pitgamim amamiyim, popular expressions that people used to say. So the Gemara says, where does this idea come from? If people have such an einfall, must have a mocker in Tanakh. So the Gemara gives a mocker in Tanakh to what people think. So he thought also, philosophy, if people come up with ideas, it usually has a mocker. It comes from the Tzelem Elokim, it comes from the person's, either the Jews being rooted in Torah, or people having a Tzelem Elokim. He didn't think that we have to be afraid of Chachma Shalom.
We're blessed to have Dean Bacon here tonight, and in one of my conversations with the Rav, actually, it took place after a group of 4 women from Stern College came to meet with the Rav. I actually married one of them, but at that time we barely knew each other. Where the Rav told me that he gave the opening shiur at the Stern Talmud program so that everybody would know how he felt about women's education and the need for women to be educated with the same passion and intellectual depth as men. Which leads us, I think, to a larger question. What was the Rav's attitude to the role of women in Jewish life, in learning, and in Jewish ritual? Rabbi Twersky, please.
My mother has shared her memories with me, how the Rav would often reminisce about the assimilation that he had witnessed in Eastern Europe. He said that those who were not present have a romanticized view and version of what was happening in Eastern Europe. That it's true that in America things were even worse, but there were serious problems with assimilation in Eastern Europe as well. And the Rav, as many other Gedolei Yisrael of the previous generation as well, clearly attributed it to the lack of chinuch, the lack of education, and felt that the prescription to reverse that trend of assimilation was intensified chinuch. And the assimilation, the problem of assimilation was especially acute with women due to the lack of any formal system of chinuch habanos, of education for girls and young women. That the tradition from mother to daughter, from within the parental home, which the Rav described so beautifully, wasn't succeeding in transmitting Torah values and in grounding the young generation in Torah. And the Rav, as in terms of the Rav's prescription for the assimilation, it was the same that other doctors, in quotation marks, wrote when the Chafetz Chaim and the Imrei Emes, the great Gerer Rebbe, and so many of the other great giants of the pre-war generation all lent their support to the Beis Yaakov movement, they were all responding to this phenomenon. Now, unquestionably, the Rav's prescription was a stronger prescription. When a doctor prescribes, so a doctor has to decide how strong a prescription. The Rav clearly advocated a much more intensive form of chinuch habanos, and unabashedly so. But it was a response, again, to the assimilation that he had witnessed in Eastern Europe, and certainly, which was an even greater problem on these shores. The Rav advocated women being taught and women studying long before there was such a thing as feminism in Jewish circles, long before that became a cause which was adopted and co-opted, and in no way bore any relationship with any such agenda. It was simply a question of transmitting the Masorah, and the Rav's opinion was that, I think that there was even a quote in the film, that just as the Chafetz Chaim had commented that now that women are literate, so women have to be given at least some basic minimal education. So the Rav said, so now women are much more than literate. Women are getting advanced degrees and a highly sophisticated secular education. He felt that it had to be matched and equaled by an equally advanced and sophisticated Torah education.
I would assume that also meant that one of the purposes of empowering women so that they can grow in their learning was to guarantee the immortality and the eternality of the Jewish home. And that since the woman was the anchor of the home, that the Rav wanted to make sure that the woman had the education to guarantee that home, as the Rav speaks about regarding his own home, how his mother was the nurturer of the home from a spiritual perspective. Is that a correct evaluation?
I think that's absolutely true. And the other source, which of course comes to mind, is in his eulogy for the Talmud Rebbitzin, where he talks about how we have two Masorahs. There's a Masorah of Musar Avicha and a Masorah of Torah Simecha, and this was the Rav's attempt to ensure and to perpetuate that second Masorah, the maternal tradition of Torah Simecha.
Rabbi Shechter, Rabbi Genack, when I was one of the Rav Shamashim, we had this call sheet, which basically was a list of different phone numbers on the sheet, and it had Rav Moshe Feinstein's phone number on it, it had Rav Ruderman's phone number on it, had Rav Cutler's phone number on it. So the Rav's relationship with Gedolim, with Rav Moshe Feinstein, with Rav Ruderman, with Rav Aaron Cutler, with Rav Schneur Cutler, with Rav Hutner, they may have disagreed on certain approaches to Torah, but it seemed to me that there was a strong relationship amongst these Gedolim. Can you please comment on that?
Well, he had close relations. I mean, what you say is true. I mean, he had close relationships with many of them. I mean, they all had the highest regard for him. I mean, it was hard not to, simply people appreciated learning because the Rav was simply such a stunning genius. And it was unknown that he was a stunning genius. He had just this extraordinary capacity to communicate Torah. But even my own community, when I'd speak to Rav Schneur Cutler, others, they'd always speak about something that the Rav told me. Rav Schneur told me that he asked the Rav his advice, and I heard this from the Rav also, about what to publish when Rabban was nifter. And then the Rav advised first put out the machshava before he put out the halacha. I remember when Rav Schneur was nifter, the Rav went to Lakewood to Menachem Avel Malkiel, told him, I was your grandfather's friend, I was your father's friend, now I'll be your friend. And of course he was very close to Moshe. Moshe was his mother's first cousin. He told me stories about the Panovich Rav. But to be candid, he had these close relationships with many of them, but he was in many approaches he was different, and and that was indicated in this film, but always rooted in the halacha. I mean, the person who the Rav admired the most, who was the Rav's hero? The Rav's hero was Reb Chaim, was his grandfather. When he speak about Reb Chaim, it was, Reb Chaim wasn't just in a different world, a different category. I remember he would say once in the shir, he said, my grandfather Reb Chaim was the greatest mind of his time. I don't mean he was the greatest Jewish mind. He was the greatest mind of his time. So, and the Ish Halacha is modeled of Reb Chaim. So when we think about where was the Rav rooted, it was in this tradition of Reb Chaim. But while he had relationships with many of them, but he was independent, and positions that he took, which were principled positions, whether it be about university education or about issues in terms of women's education, set him apart at least in certain areas. But I don't think it ever in any way fractured the relationships that he had with them. Rabbi Twersky's, Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky once told me that the Rav once gave a class in his house in Brookline. Some conservative rabbis asked to study with him about some issue, and they came to the Rav. And Rabban Kotler apparently heard about this and was very upset, and he called the Rav up about it. And the Rav said, I don't understand your position. They're coming to me. I'm teaching them Dvar Hashem. So, there are obviously differences between them, sometimes in nuance, but it never represented a fracture in terms of the relationship, because the relationship was always there, and people always recognized how special he was. And he was very gracious, I think, and generous in terms of the way he viewed them as well.
Just a footnote, quite a few years ago, a volume was published on Bava Metzia, I think, of the notes of Reb Chaim Soleveitchik that Rav Soleveitchik had. And someone printed it without permission of the family. So there was a very negative introduction that was written to that volume, where they quoted some negative comment that Rabbi Yankiv Kamenetsky had said about Rav Soleveitchik. So Nosson Kamenetsky was interviewed by an Israeli newspaper. So he said the whole story is not true. And he was telling, he wrote this, it was printed in the newspapers, I think. He showed it to us, that there was a time that Rabbi Yankiv Kamenetsky came to Rav Soleveitchik and he pleaded with him. He wanted to open a yeshiva in Boston. He lived in Canada at that time. He wanted the Rav to be the Rosh Yeshiva, and he wanted to be the Mashgiach of the yeshiva. And the Rav said he didn't think that Boston was ready for yeshiva at that time. But otherwise, he said his father, Rabbi Yankiv, was kofuf to the Rav. And he said that before he started the whole conversation with the Rav, he wanted to start the yeshiva. So they first spoke in learning. Rabbi Yankiv Kamenetsky suggested an interpretation of the Rambam, an original interpretation of a certain Rambam in Hilchos Malachim. So the Rav approved. So he said, Nosson Kamenetsky said his father, all the years, would say over that Torah, and he said, Rav Soleveitchik approved Mashtigol Torah, that he liked it. He said he was very respectful of the Rav.
There's a famous thought they say that, it's always machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Hillel and Shammai themselves didn't fight that often. It was, the second tier people where the machlokes appears.
There's one more question that I'd like to ask, but before I do that, if I may, I'd like to also say a little hakaras hatov to some of the people here tonight who worked on this event. I want to thank Georgia Pollack from Communications and her wonderful staff, to Jeff Rosengarten and his unbelievable staff. And I want to particularly thank Alan Brava, who really made this happen. The final question is to Rabbi Twersky and then to everybody else. And that is, what was the Rav like as a grandfather? At the end of the day, tell me who was the Rav, how he should calibrate our souls, and what do you think his legacy is? And please do it in 5 minutes.
Chaim Volozhiner has a comment in his commentary in Pirkei Avos, Ruach Chaim. The opening mission in Pirkei Avos, of course, traces the chain of transmission, the Masorah, Moshe Kivel Torah, Misinai, Masorah, Yehoshua, and so on. But Chaim Volozhiner explains how each link in this glorious tradition of transmission was characterized by a special quality of anova, of humility. Moshe Rabbeinu received Torah from Sinai because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one about whom the Torah said, "Va'ish Moshe onav ma'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei adama." That Moshe Rabbeinu was exceedingly humble. Growing up as a young child, the only thing that I knew that was distinctive about my grandfather was that most people's grandfathers didn't commute to New York for 2 or 3 days a week, and mind that he went off every Tuesday morning carrying his own valise, as he was wont to call it, and he came back Thursday afternoon. Usually he timed it depending upon the time of the year. He knew that sometimes we struggled for Mincha Ma'ariv Minyan in my father's shtibel, so he would come straight to the shtibel to make the minyan. And there was nothing about the way he carried himself, there was nothing about his conduct that made you think that he was anyone different or anyone special. There was no trappings of greatness, of royalty around him. He was exceedingly humble, as had to be the case given his greatness. His interaction on a personal level, also very warm, caring, involved, consistent with what Rabbi Soleveitchik describes as one of the manifestations of anova, of humility, which is identifying with people, their needs, and their problems. In terms of, at the end of the day, the end of the night as the case may be, who the Rav was, the Rav was a giant of Torah. First and foremost, a giant of Torah who towered not only in his generation, but you could have transplanted him back to the generation of Reb Kiva Eger. You could have transplanted him back to the generation of the Shach, of the Ramah. He would have been a towering presence in any of those generations. By the force of his persona, because of his greatness in Torah, and because when people looked at him, they knew that, again, that in addition to that singular mastery and creativity within Torah, this was a man who also knew all Chochmah in the world. He, by the force of his persona, by the force of his teachings, was a testimony to the eternity of Torah, to the fact that Torah can be, should be lived, observed, and studied in any time, in any place. And ultimately, I think that's what he stood for, that's what he represented, and that's what his legacy for us is.
Well, I think the Rav's legacy lies in two areas. One is just a historical area, historical fact. In the 1950s, many sociologists, many people wrote off American Orthodoxy, even, and probably more broadly, even American Jewry. Famously, Life magazine had a cover issue about the demise of the American Jew. American Jew survives. Actually, it wasn't Life, it was Look magazine. Look magazine, of course, has since disappeared. But part of the reason that American Jewry survived is because of the Rav, both in terms of the positions that he took, preserved the Orthodox synagogue, Jewish education, but also the model that he represented for the broad American Jew, even more universally for beyond that, even the non-Jewish community, because as Meir points out, it was this extraordinary confluence of such genius and grasp in so many different areas. Rabbi Lamb once told me that there was a very correct observation. The Rav, he had many students, and some students were, really excelled in certain areas. But you never find a person, both not only in terms of the breadth, that he was not just a great philosopher, he was the greatest philosopher and theologian of his time. He wasn't just a great Talmid Chacham, he was the greatest Talmid Chacham of his time. He wasn't just an eloquent speaker, he was the most eloquent speaker of his time. And all these extraordinary characteristics were in one person. So he served also as a model and inspiration to so many people. There's another quality, I just want to speak about the Rebbe just one second, I found so refreshing about him. May point out, there was no pretense about him. There was no, he was just so extraordinary. What happens nowadays, there's a gerontocracy. You become a gadol. It starts thinking about it, man, when you're 85 years old. But when he was 13 years old, he wrote a kuntras. It's printed in, his kuntras Chaslavich, which Chaim Brisker was just stunning. This was a 13-year-old boy. This was a bar mitzvah boy writing. So the genius. The other quality was his extraordinary integrity, and in terms of his positions that he took in monetary areas, and also the other element I wanted to just mention with this close is his belief in the individual. In the old debate between the individual and the state or the corporate area, he came down on the side of the individual. He had much greater faith in individuals. He was very wary of organizations. He once commented that because of this, each person is unique. What I spoke about before, they don't merge together in one cohesive. And that's why he said, I'm reluctant to go to meetings. And it was that confidence in the individual. When I say confidence in the individual, I don't mean that a person, because this is a misrepresentation of his position, to say, well, he had confidence in everybody, and everybody can have a position on a halachic issue. Well, that would be nonsense. He didn't even think in the shir. Not everybody's entitled to that. It requires a certain amount of erudition, and just you wouldn't go to a doctor and ask you. Everybody has a position about something, but he did have confidence in the individual. And I think it was from the individual, not the whole, the organization, but that he believed that it was because of the Tzeleman Elokim that from that would be the wellspring for the reemergence of American Jewry. And I think if that we see here at Yeshiva and other places, but the medrash that are filled, he played an important contribution, much more significant than people even recognize, to the preservation of that tradition on American soil, something that could not have been anticipated. And the things that he did were just were so courageous, starting Maimonides, little by little, teaching one, two. It's like a picture that the Chazal tell us about Rabbi Akiva after the Churban, after such destruction. Rabbi Akiva was the one who taught this 5 students. When he went to the Torah, the Rav said, that's really what we celebrate like one. And he rebuilt Torah. And that's what the Rav did. It was those are rare individuals, historic individuals within the ferment of Jewish history. There's Rabbi Akiva, but there was also Rabbi Soleveitchik. His integrity, his genius, we're all the beneficiaries of.
To say who Rav Soleveitchik was, my impression was he was a very big Talmid Chacham. That's the main thing. Everything else, all the philosophy and everything else, everything was an aspect of the big Talmid Chacham that he was. And his position was that he insisted that we cannot preserve Yiddishkeit if it's just going to be in a little corner, a little winkle. You're going to have religious Jews just in Williamsburg. You're just going to have religious Jews in Muncie. We have to have religious Jews all over in every area. He was very proud of the fact that we have alumni of Yeshiva College who are experts in chemistry and physics and medicine and lawyers and so on, who are very big Talmidei Chachamim, not just Yodei Sefer. He said he knew the highest level that was produced by a German jury under Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's guidance. He said those who were not in the rabbinate, the Balabatan, they were Yodei Sefer. But he says he succeeded. He was very happy. He succeeded, and the yeshiva succeeded in having doctors, lawyers, engineers who know K'tzais and Nesivos. Not stum, they know how to look in a Sefer. They know how to find out, to look up a psak. They're talking, learning. Some of these people who are in secular fields are bigger Talmid Chacham than rabbis in yeshivas. Just that they're not cut out to be rabbis in yeshivas, so they went to a secular field. So he felt that this was essential for preserving Yiddishkeit in America. You have to have outstanding Talmid Chachamim all over. You cannot just concentrate everybody in Williamsburg. That was the lotion that he used to say. You have to have all over.
Before we conclude the evening, I want to just ask Rabbi Charlap if he could just say a few words.
It's very difficult for me to comment now. I saw the movie twice. The first time I cried unabashedly, and I cried almost as much now. And then to be followed by the Talmidim of the Rav, all of them were extraordinary. We come off Parshas B'Shalach. The beginning of Parshas B'Shalach, Vayikach Moshe es Atzmos Yosef. And Moses takes the bones of Joseph. This documentary, to my mind, and I just thought of it as I was sitting here today because I don't have a note in front of me. To my mind, this documentary, what happened tonight, is another form of Vayikach Moshe es Asmos Rabbeinu Yosef Dov Halevi Soleveitchik. And the Gemara tells us all the years that the Jews trekked to the wilderness, there were two aronos, two boxes that marched with them side by side. And Shoalim and the Shavim and the Omdim and the Chosrim would ask the question, Ma tivon shel otan aronos? What is the nature, what is the purpose of having a box of atzomos? And next to it is the box of the Shechina himself. This is what it was. The box of Yosef and the box of the Shechina. And the answer was, no. That the one who is in this box, the atzomos of Yosef, and don't forget who Yosef was. Yosef was the viceroy of all Egypt. He was brought up in a strange culture. He lived through dungeons. You cannot imagine the variety and the disparate nature of Joseph's life. And at the end, he is called, no matter how many people resented him, from his family at the very beginning to all the world. But at the end, he remains Yosef HaTzadik. Ki the one who is in this box, fulfilled everything that is in this box in the Shechina. And that's what I feel tonight, and I've always felt it. Ki Atzmos Yosef Dov Halevi when he was alive, and he still is alive. This week alone, 3 of his Talmidim published for him. In 1 week they brought to my office 3 of his Talmidim. And it's happening almost every week. It's unbelievable, incredible. Ki mi shev oron zu ma shekosuv boron zeh. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for joining us here tonight.